the number appears again. And again. And again. 40 days of rain falling over the earth while Noah waits inside an ark surrounded by silence and judgment. 40 years of Israel wandering through a wilderness that should have taken only weeks to cross. 40 days Moses spends alone on a mountain covered in fire and cloud before carrying the law down to his people. 40 days Elijah walks through exhaustion and despair before hearing the voice of God in the wilderness. And then, centuries later, Jesus enters the desert for 40 days of fasting, temptation, and spiritual confrontation before beginning his ministry. At first, the pattern feels accidental. A strange numerical coincidence scattered across disconnected stories. But the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to ignore. Why does this number keep appearing at the exact moments when everything is changing? Why does Scripture repeatedly attach the number 40 to testing, transformation, judgment, waiting, suffering, revelation, and preparation? And perhaps the stranger question is this: what if these stories were never meant to be read separately? Ancient Jewish readers understood something modern readers often miss. In the biblical world, numbers were not always just mathematical. Sometimes they carried symbolic meaning. Sometimes they communicated spiritual ideas hidden beneath the surface of the text. Which raises a possibility that changes the way you read the Bible entirely. What if the number 40 is not random at all? What if it is a pattern? And what if every appearance of that pattern is pointing toward the same hidden spiritual truth? To modern readers, numbers usually feel cold and mathematical, nothing more than tools for measuring quantity. But the ancient Hebrew world saw them differently. In Scripture, numbers often carried meaning beyond arithmetic. They functioned like symbols, patterns woven into the architecture of the biblical story itself. Certain numbers appear so consistently, and at such important moments, that the repetition becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The number 7 repeatedly symbolizes completion and divine fullness. The number 12 becomes associated with covenant structure and God's people, from the 12 tribes of Israel to the 12 apostles. Even the number 3 often marks moments of emphasis, revelation, or divine encounter. Biblical writers were deeply aware of these patterns, and ancient audiences would have recognized them immediately. That is why the number 40 matters. Again and again, Scripture attaches 40 to moments of transition. Not ordinary transitions, but painful ones. Wilderness seasons. Waiting seasons. Seasons where something old is dying while something new is being prepared beneath the surface. 40 appears when people are being tested. It appears when God is reshaping identity. It appears before revelation, breakthrough, judgment, or mission. The pattern stretches across centuries, across prophets, kings, nations, and eventually Jesus himself. And once you begin seeing it, you realize something remarkable. The Bible is not presenting disconnected stories stitched together randomly over time. It is presenting recurring spiritual patterns, echoes that repeat from one generation to another with astonishing consistency. The number 40 becomes one of those echoes. A symbolic threshold between what someone was and what they are about to become. And the first time that pattern fully emerges, the world itself is covered in water while a single family waits inside an ark, surrounded by 40 days and 40 nights of rain. This is what makes biblical symbolism so fascinating. The patterns are not hidden to confuse the reader, but to invite deeper reflection. The repetition slows you down. It forces you to ask why certain themes, numbers, and images continue resurfacing at pivotal moments throughout Scripture, as though the Bible is quietly building toward a larger revelation. The first time the number 40 fully dominates the biblical story, the world is collapsing beneath endless rain. Genesis describes humanity descending into violence, corruption, and moral ruin until creation itself feels inverted. The earth that once emerged from water in Genesis now begins sinking back beneath it. And at the center of that unraveling stands Noah, a man building an ark while the skies remain clear, obeying a warning nobody else believes. Then the rain begins. Not for a few hours. Not for a single storm. 40 days and 40 nights without interruption. In Scripture, rain usually symbolizes blessing, life, and provision. But here, the blessing becomes judgment. water becomes undoing. The same element that sustains life now washes an entire civilization away. The imagery is unsettling because the flood is not merely about punishment. It is about cleansing. The old world, poisoned by violence and rebellion, is being stripped away so something new can emerge on the other side. And that pattern matters, because this becomes the first major biblical revelation attached to the number 40. Before renewal comes disruption. Before rebirth comes collapse. Before new creation emerges, the old creation must pass away. The flood narrative carries echoes of Genesis itself. Darkness. Water. Chaos. Then eventually, dry land appearing once again. It is almost as though creation is happening a second time. Noah steps out of the ark into a world washed clean, a reset humanity standing beneath a covenant marked by a rainbow stretched across the sky. But notice something important. The transformation does not happen instantly. The 40 days represent a threshold period, a space between the old world dying and the new world beginning. Scripture repeatedly treats 40 as that kind of boundary line, where God allows something painful, uncertain, or uncomfortable to prepare the way for something entirely new. And once that symbolic pattern is established, it begins appearing again in another wilderness, this time not surrounded by floodwaters, but by endless desert sand and a nation struggling to trust the God who rescued them. If Noah's 40 days revealed that God sometimes washes away the old before creating something new, Israel's 40 years in the wilderness reveal something even more personal. Sometimes God rescues people physically long before they are ready spiritually. Israel's journey to the Promised Land should have been short. Geographically, the distance from Egypt to Canaan was not enormous. Under normal conditions, the journey could have taken only weeks. But instead, an entire generation wandered through the wilderness for 40 years beneath scorching heat, surrounded by uncertainty, carrying the tension between freedom and fear. At first, the wilderness feels like punishment. And in part, it was. Numbers 14 explains that Israel repeatedly resisted trusting God despite witnessing miracle after miracle. They saw the Red Sea split open. They ate bread falling from heaven. They watched water pour from rocks in the desert. Yet fear still controlled them. When they finally stood at the edge of the Promised Land, they believed the giants in Canaan were greater than the God who brought them there. But beneath the judgment, something deeper was happening. The wilderness was becoming a place of transformation. Egypt had released Israel physically, but Egypt still lived inside their minds. They thought like slaves. They feared like slaves. They depended on visible security because slavery had trained them to survive, not to trust. And before God could lead them into promise, He had to teach them dependence. Deuteronomy later explains that God led them through the wilderness to humble them, test them, and reveal what was truly inside their hearts. The desert stripped away illusions. There were no distractions there. No false comforts. No backup plans. Only daily dependence on God for food, water, direction, and survival. That is what makes the wilderness so emotionally powerful in Scripture. It becomes more than a location. It becomes a spiritual condition. A place where certainty disappears and trust is exposed. And honestly, most people understand that feeling more than they realize. There are seasons in life that feel exactly like wilderness. Seasons where prayers seem unanswered, where direction feels unclear, where progress feels painfully slow. Seasons where people wonder why God rescued them from one situation only to lead them into another difficult place. But the biblical pattern suggests the wilderness is rarely meaningless. Often, it is preparation disguised as delay. Because throughout Scripture, God repeatedly forms people in hidden places before bringing them into visible purpose. And nowhere is that pattern clearer than in the life of Moses himself, a man who repeatedly disappears into the presence of God for 40 days at a time while an entire nation waits below the mountain. By the time Israel reaches Mount Sinai, the wilderness has already exposed something uncomfortable about the human heart. Freedom does not automatically produce faith. Even after miracles, people still struggle to trust what they cannot control. And against that backdrop, Moses begins climbing a mountain wrapped in fire, smoke, thunder, and cloud. Exodus describes Sinai almost like the meeting point between heaven and earth. The mountain trembles. Trumpets sound. Smoke rises as though creation itself is reacting to the presence of God. Then Moses disappears into the cloud for 40 days and 40 nights. And while Israel waits below, Moses waits above. That contrast is one of the most revealing details in the entire story. On the mountain, there is silence, surrender, revelation, and communion with God. Below the mountain, there is impatience, fear, anxiety, and chaos. The people grow restless because heaven is not moving according to their timeline. Eventually, they melt gold into a calf and create something visible to worship because uncertainty feels unbearable. The tragedy is deeply human. People often prefer a controllable false god over waiting for the real one. Meanwhile, Moses remains hidden inside the cloud. 40 days isolated from normal life. 40 days away from comfort, noise, and distraction. And it is there, in prolonged stillness, that revelation comes. The law is given. Covenant language is spoken. Divine instruction is received. That pattern appears again. Before revelation comes separation. Before clarity comes waiting. Scripture repeatedly shows that God forms people in hidden places long before he uses them publicly. The mountain becomes a place where Moses is stripped away from distraction until he can receive something eternal. The waiting is not empty. It is preparation. And maybe that is one of the hardest spiritual truths for modern people to accept. We often want immediate answers, immediate direction, immediate clarity. But throughout the Bible, God frequently speaks after periods of surrender, silence, and endurance. The 40 days on Sinai were not simply about receiving commandments carved into stone. They were about transformation through proximity to God. And centuries later, another exhausted prophet would enter another wilderness for another 40-day journey, discovering that God is not always found in fire, earthquakes, or spectacle, but sometimes in a voice quiet enough to be missed entirely. Few moments in Scripture capture emotional exhaustion more honestly than Elijah after Mount Carmel. Days earlier, Elijah stood before the prophets of Baal and called fire down from heaven. Rain finally returned after years of drought. False prophets fell. An entire nation witnessed the power of God. From the outside, it looked like spiritual triumph. Then everything collapsed. When Queen Jezebel threatened his life, fear overtook him completely. The same prophet who confronted kings suddenly ran into the wilderness begging God to let him die. 1 Kings says he sat beneath a broom tree and prayed, "It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life." Scripture does not hide his despair. It records it with startling honesty. And maybe that honesty matters because so many people know this feeling. Sometimes victory is followed by exhaustion instead of celebration. Sometimes people appear spiritually strong while privately carrying loneliness, anxiety, disappointment, and emotional fatigue heavy enough to crush them. But instead of condemning Elijah, God responds gently. Before giving instruction, God gives rest. Elijah sleeps. An angel wakes him with food and water. Then Elijah sleeps again. That detail feels deeply compassionate. God understands human weakness better than humans do. Afterward, Elijah journeys 40 days and 40 nights through the wilderness toward Mount Horeb, the mountain connected with Moses and divine encounter. But unlike Moses entering thunder and fire, Elijah arrives broken, hiding inside a cave while wondering why faithfulness still feels painful. Then comes one of the most beautiful moments in Scripture. A violent wind tears through the mountains, but God is not in the wind. An earthquake shakes the earth, but God is not in the earthquake. Fire appears, but God is not in the fire. Finally, there comes a still small voice. And suddenly the pattern becomes clearer. The wilderness was not punishment. It was restoration. The 40 days were not about destroying Elijah, but slowing him down long enough to hear God again beneath fear, noise, and exhaustion. And centuries later, another man would enter the wilderness for 40 days, preparing for a confrontation far greater than exhaustion alone. That connection to modern life is difficult to ignore. Many people live in invisible wilderness seasons. They continue working, serving, praying, and smiling while quietly carrying spiritual fatigue nobody else notices. Some feel abandoned because God seems silent after seasons where His presence once felt obvious. Others wonder why prayers feel weaker than they used to, or why faith suddenly feels heavier than before. Elijah's story reminds weary people that silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes God leads people away from noise because exhausted hearts cannot hear clearly anymore. Sometimes the wilderness becomes the place where ambition dies, performance fades, and intimacy with God quietly returns. The same prophet who once saw fire fall from heaven eventually discovered that God's deepest restoration arrived through gentleness, stillness, and a voice quiet enough to miss completely. And that quiet encounter prepared Elijah for the next chapter of obedience, endurance, and purpose. By the time the number 40 reaches the story of Jesus, the pattern is no longer subtle. It is deliberate, layered, and impossible to separate from everything that came before it. Immediately after his baptism, before a single miracle is performed, before a single sermon is preached, the Spirit leads Jesus into the wilderness for 40 days. That detail matters. Not after ministry. Before it. The wilderness comes first. And suddenly, echoes from earlier biblical stories begin surfacing everywhere. Israel passed through water at the Red Sea before entering the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus passes through the waters of baptism before entering the wilderness for 40 days. Israel was called God's son in Exodus. At Jesus' baptism, the voice from heaven declares, "This is my beloved Son." The parallels are intentional. But unlike Israel, Jesus succeeds where humanity repeatedly failed. Israel spent 40 years complaining about bread in the wilderness. Jesus refuses to turn stones into bread even while starving. Israel tested God repeatedly in the desert. Jesus refuses to test the Father even when tempted. Israel chased false worship and idolatry. Jesus rejects the offer of earthly kingdoms in exchange for compromise. Every temptation strikes at identity, trust, and obedience. And that is what makes the wilderness so spiritually intense. The desert strips away distraction. There are no crowds there. No comfort. No applause. Only hunger, silence, weakness, and confrontation. After 40 days of fasting, Jesus faces temptation at the edge of physical exhaustion. Satan does not appear during strength, but during vulnerability. That pattern still feels painfully familiar. Human beings are often tempted most deeply when they are tired, isolated, discouraged, uncertain, or emotionally depleted. The wilderness exposes what comfort can hide. It reveals what people truly depend on when everything unnecessary is removed. But here, something extraordinary happens. Where Adam failed in a garden full of abundance, Jesus remains faithful in a barren wilderness filled with deprivation. Where Israel collapsed under testing, Jesus stands firm under pressure. The wilderness becomes the place where Christ begins reversing the failures of humanity itself. And this is where the meaning of 40 reaches its deepest fulfillment. In Noah's story, 40 brought cleansing before a new world emerged. In Israel's story, 40 became preparation before entering promise. For Moses, 40 preceded revelation. For Elijah, 40 became restoration after exhaustion. But in Jesus, all those meanings converge together. The wilderness becomes a battleground between the brokenness of humanity and the obedience of the Son of God. 40 is no longer just about testing. It becomes the pathway toward redemption itself. And notice something remarkable. Jesus does not leave the wilderness weakened spiritually. He leaves empowered. Luke says he returned in the power of the Spirit. The wilderness was not a detour from his mission. It was preparation for it. That changes how the entire biblical pattern is understood. Again and again, Scripture reveals the same spiritual rhythm. God prepares people privately before using them publicly. The hidden place comes before the visible assignment. Testing comes before authority. Surrender comes before breakthrough. And once you begin placing all these stories beside one another, a much larger pattern starts emerging beneath the surface of Scripture itself. Noah, Israel, Moses, Elijah, Jesus. Different people, different centuries, different circumstances. Yet the same mysterious number continues appearing at moments of transition, purification, preparation, and transformation, as though the Bible has been quietly repeating the same spiritual truth all along. At this point, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Noah passes through 40 days of rain before stepping into a cleansed world. Israel wanders 40 years before entering the Promised Land. Moses remains on the mountain 40 days before receiving revelation. Elijah journeys 40 days before hearing the voice of God again. Jesus fasts 40 days before beginning the ministry that would change human history forever. Different stories. Different generations. Different struggles. Yet the same number keeps appearing at the exact moments where transformation begins. And maybe that is because the number 40 was never really about time alone. It was about preparation. In Scripture, 40 consistently marks the space between what was and what is about to become. It appears in the uncomfortable middle, the transition season where old identities are stripped away and new ones are quietly formed. Again and again, God seems to do his deepest work in hidden places long before the world sees the outcome publicly. That changes the way suffering, waiting, and wilderness seasons are understood. Because modern culture treats hidden seasons like wasted seasons. If nothing visible is happening, people assume nothing meaningful is happening either. But the Bible tells a completely different story. Noah was being prepared inside the ark before a new world emerged. Israel was being reshaped in the wilderness before entering promise. Moses was being transformed on the mountain before leading a nation. Elijah was being restored in isolation before continuing his prophetic calling. Jesus was confronting temptation privately before confronting darkness publicly. The pattern repeats with astonishing consistency. God often prepares people in obscurity before revealing purpose openly. And suddenly the number 40 stops feeling like an ancient biblical detail and starts feeling deeply personal. Because almost everyone eventually experiences some version of a wilderness season. A season where life feels uncertain, delayed, hidden, uncomfortable, or painfully slow. But Scripture keeps whispering the same truth through every appearance of 40. The wilderness is rarely the end of the story. More often, it is where the next chapter quietly begins. And once that realization settles in, the question shifts from, "Why am I here?" to something far more important. What might God be preparing me for? Maybe that is why these stories continue resonating thousands of years later. Because most people eventually experience a season that feels like wilderness. A season where prayers seem unanswered. Where life feels uncertain, quiet, delayed, or painfully unclear. Some people enter a 40 through grief. Others through burnout, betrayal, loneliness, disappointment, illness, or waiting for answers that never seem to arrive. And in those moments, the silence can feel unbearable. That is often when people begin asking dangerous questions. Did God forget me? Did I miss my purpose? Why does everyone else seem to be moving forward while I feel stuck? But the biblical pattern surrounding 40 tells a very different story. Again and again, Scripture shows God doing some of his deepest work in hidden seasons. Noah could not yet see the new world forming beyond the storm. Israel could not yet see the promised land beyond the desert. Elijah could not yet see restoration beyond exhaustion. Even Jesus entered the wilderness before stepping fully into mission. The waiting was not abandonment. It was preparation. And maybe that changes how some people need to view their current season. What feels like delay may actually be formation. What feels like silence may actually be God removing distractions so his voice becomes clearer. What feels like isolation may become the place where identity is rebuilt. Because throughout Scripture, God rarely rushes transformation. He shapes people slowly, quietly, and often invisibly before revealing what he was preparing all along. And perhaps the most comforting truth hidden inside every biblical 40 is this. None of those wilderness seasons lasted forever. Every storm eventually stopped. Every desert journey eventually ended. Every hidden season eventually opened into something new. Which means your wilderness may not be evidence that God has left you. It may be evidence that He is still working. The wilderness was never the destination. Not for Noah. Not for Israel. Not for Moses, Elijah, or even Jesus. In every biblical story, the season of 40 eventually opened into something greater. A new world after the flood. A promise beyond the desert. Revelation beyond the mountain. Restoration beyond exhaustion. Ministry beyond temptation. Again and again, Scripture reveals the same quiet truth. God often does His deepest work in hidden places before anyone else can see the outcome. And maybe that changes how we see our own wilderness seasons. Because if the biblical pattern holds true, then silence is not always abandonment. Waiting is not always punishment. Sometimes the places that feel empty are the very places where transformation begins. The desert may feel endless while you are inside it. But throughout Scripture, every season of 40 eventually leads somewhere.